We finished up chapter 20 of Proverbs last week and got into the first two verses of chapter 21. Just in the way of a kind of a quick review, we started off in verse 13 of chapter 20. Verse 14, we talked about where it says, Solomon writes, "It's good for nothing, cries the buyer, but when he has gone his way, then he boasts." It's one thing, Solomon says, to negotiate for a good deal. There's nothing wrong with that. But to purposely lie and devalue something in order to get it at a better price is certainly wrong. And we gave an example of the cotton graders back in the days when they would grade cotton at a much less value than what it was worth so that they could get more money. Not something you want to do. Verse 15 is a theme throughout Proverbs where knowledge and wisdom is more precious than jewels or gold, precious metals. Verse 21, "An inheritance gained hastily at the beginning will not be blessed at the end." We talked about how that kind of resembled the prodigal son in that he wanted his inheritance right away, took it, spent it foolishly, lost it all. Certainly was not blessed at the end until he came to himself, which is one of my favorite parts of that story. Verse 22, "Do not say, 'I will recompense evil.' Wait for the Lord, he will save you." We don't want to repay evil with evil. Remember, we talked about that God says vengeance belongs to him. Verse 25, we talked about making promises, vows, rashly, without thought. A lot of times we get caught up in the moment, say something on TV about hungry children or something like that. We make a pledge of money that really we can't afford to do, and then afterwards we're kind of feeling pretty bad about it. We have to renege on those vows, those promises, and that's never good. Verse 27, the spirit of man, that's the conscience we talked about. I shared with you my story about the French bread at Food for Less and how I got the wrong one and I left the one loaf of bread where it shouldn't be. And it's just, when I was walking to the cash register, it's just like you see in the cartoons. Little guy on my right shoulder comes up, dressed in white, halo over his head, and says, "Now, Charles, you know the right thing to do is go back." And so you turn around and go back, and all of a sudden the little guy in red suit, the pitchfork, rears his little head and says, "Oh, come on, don't be a pansy. That's what clerks do." Back and forth. And I tell you, if people looked at me, they must have said, "That poor man needs help." But the good part about it, the good side, if you will, of my conscience won out. Verse 29, we talked about the glory of young men as their strength and the splendor of old men as their gray head. Both youthfulness and age has its advantages and disadvantages. One is not better than the other. It's just different. Just different. One of the things, going back to verse 27, I wanted to share with you about the conscience. It's like the story about the fight of two wolves within you. I think many of you probably have heard it. I want to read it to you because it really bears reading. An old Cherokee is teaching his grandson about life. He says, "A fight is going on inside me," he says to the boy. "It's a terrible fight, and it's between two wolves. One is evil, he is angry, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego." And he continued, "The other is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on inside you and inside every other person too." The grandson thought for a moment, and then he asked his grandfather, "Which wolf will win?" And the old Cherokee simply replied, "The one you feed." And that's so true when you think about it. We can dwell on the good or on the bad. It's up to us. But I thought that was interesting. Kind of went hand in hand with that verse. And then verse 30, we talked about severe punishment is a cleansing for evil, is that it helps develop the conscience to abstain from wrong. And that's true, but we live in a society today that almost rewards people who do wrong. They live in an air-conditioned cell when it's hot, heat when it's warm, 3 meals a day, color TV, free time to work out at the gym. Sounds like a resort of some sort at times. Remember back in the day, a few years back, Jake, help me if you can, it was the sheriff in Arizona, certain county, had put tents up out in the heat of the desert, and that's where they lived in, those who were incarcerated. They didn't get all those free things. Yeah, that's who it was, exactly. Yes? Uh-huh. Yeah. Oh, yeah. He was not of one to make the life easier for the criminal. He wanted them to pay the price. We started then on chapter 21. Just got for the first 2 verses. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, like the rivers of water. He turns it wherever he wishes. Just like a farmer can direct water to go where he wants to irrigate certain crops. The Lord, by providential arrangement, sets up whoever he wills to carry out his desires. The Bible is filled with stories about imperfect men doing God's work. The point is, we need to understand that God is in charge and not forget that. Verse 2 of chapter 21, every way of man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the hearts. We've discussed this already, that man makes his own plans, but God controls his final destiny. Jeremiah 10:23, O Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself. Are there any questions or comments about the review up to this point? Okay, let's begin in verse 3 of chapter 21 of Proverbs. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. This is really a powerful proverb when you break it down and understand it. Solomon says here, righteousness and justice are more desirable than sacrifice. Now, do not misunderstand this to mean that worship is not as important as good morals. Instead, the point is that formal, outward ritual is of no value without inward, sincere dedication and righteousness. Does that make sense? Has to come within. The point being, and the application to us is, are we just going through the motions of going to church? Went to church today, got that X in the block. I did good. Is that what we go through sometimes? Hope not. You know, this relationship that we have with our Lord should be one of a deep feeling. When we gather around the table and partake of the emblems, maybe we well up our eyes with tears for the gratefulness of what God did for us and the love he had for us in sending his Son. Things like that. Mark. Yeah. Yeah. Words, our actions will speak louder than our words. You know, all the time. Other comments? Okay. Let's go to verse number 4. A haughty look, a proud heart, and the plowing of the wicked are sin. Now, if you have the NIV or the ESV, it will say the lamp of the wicked are sin. Okay? In a certain consequence of pride. With haughtiness, one may feel sure of himself, but this is a treacherous guide throughout life. I like how that ESV and NIV says lamp, meaning prosperity. It will bring one to destruction if you're not careful. Verses 5 through 7 kind of tie in together. We'll read all three of them and then go back. The plans of the diligent lead surely to plenty, but those of everyone who is hasty surely to poverty. Getting treasures by a lying tongue is the fleeting fantasy of those who seek death. The violence of the wicked will destroy them because they refuse to do justice. Going back to verse 5, diligence here is contrasted with hastiness. How would you define the word diligence? Anybody? To be diligent, steadfast, careful, pursuit, a persistent work or effort to put in. I think those are all good ways to describe that and define it. Solomon points out here the desire to gain wealth without sacrifice of honest labor and frugality will lead to lying and all kinds of evil. Now, that frugality, it comes from the root word frugal. What does it mean to be frugal? Cheap? Good, I guess. Thrifty? Wise? Yeah, these are all good. It means also sparingly or economically, especially when it comes to money or food, being frugal with that. Turn over with me to 1 Timothy chapter 6. First Timothy chapter 6, beginning in verse 9, we'll read 9 and 10 together. Paul writes, "But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and snare, and to many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition." Most misquoted verse in the Bible, I believe, "For the love of money," it's not money, but the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. The bottom line here is high rollers tend to be high losers. Okay? And they come to poverty. Think about the stories and movies you've seen of people who win lots of money in Vegas or someplace like that, only to turn around and lose it again because they want more. Greed. Greed takes care of that. What causes it? Diligence with righteousness gives one the advantage. I think this is very important. Any comments? Okay, let's go to verse 8. The way of a guilty man is perverse, but as for the pure, his work is right. Now, if you have the New American Standard, it says the way of a guilty man is crooked. Okay? But as for the pure, his work is straight. And that's also, I believe, in the New King James, or the NIV. Conduct is upright. Okay? Nothing earth-shattering here, just a statement of the facts. Okay? When we have a guilty man is perverse or crooked, but the pure is upright, straight, and does things how they should be done. Pretty self-explanatory. Verse 9. It is better to dwell in a corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman. Now, this must be a pretty important thought to get across because 3 times Solomon writes about this. If you go over to verse 19 of this same chapter, it says, Solomon writes, it's better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman. And then over in chapter 25 and verse 24, it says the same thing. Now, to be fair, in all fairness, the same thing is true of a nagging husband. Okay, we just can't point out the women. But what is Solomon saying here? Yeah, that's probably a well-said point, yeah. Yeah, happy wife, happy life. That's true. It's true. The thing I think that he's pointing out here, you need to work things out. I mean, we all have our disagreements, our discussions, okay? We need to work things out. Need to work things out. Any thoughts or additional comments on that? Okay, verse 10. The soul of the wicked desires evil. His neighbor finds no favor in his eyes. This proverb states an important truth about depravity, namely that men sin not merely from weakness, but eagerly and ruthlessly. Okay? They desire to commit wickedness. Have you ever noticed that? People who are not good people, they just keep doing the same thing, almost like they try to outdo themselves. They like it. They think it's fun. Verse 11. When the scoffer is punished, the simple is made wise. Now, we've discussed this before back in chapter 19 and verse 25, where it says, strike a scoffer and the simple will become wary. Reprove one who has understanding, and he will discern knowledge. The scorner may not repent when punished, but the simple will observe and be wiser and grow from that experience. Verse 12. The righteous God wisely considers the house of the wicked, overthrowing the wicked for their wickedness. God understands everything. We must never, ever forget that. Those who are righteous reflect concerning the house of the wicked as well. Question. Do you ever at times wonder why it seems the ungodly prosper while the godly suffer and hurt? Is that fair? It's not fair, but it's a fact. That happens. How does a person get through that? That's exactly right. The way you cope with it is that you understand the final outcome. You understand the judgment day. Okay? And I like what Burton Kaufman wrote about this. He says, remember, God's payday is not the same as man's. But he does keep immaculate books without any mathematical errors, and he will pay accurately. Remember what Galatians 6 and 7 says. Whatsoever a man sows, that shall he reap. Yes. Yeah. Not happy. That's absolutely true. We only see a lot of times the outward result of their wealth, if you will, that they have lots of things, but they could be very, very hurting inside because of family relations and everything. Jack?
I knew a lady that I was dealt with a dairy goat, and her husband won the lottery about 20 years ago. They had a close family relationship. She took care of animals in her house, everything else. She was happy. The money, husband got the money, he went to the fishing boat to stay that fishing boat.
Yeah, doesn't make sense. Money can change people. A lot of times for bad, not for good. Other thoughts or comments? Mary? Yeah. Yeah. What's that bumper sticker I talked about? Know God, N-O God, know N-O peace, K-N-O-W God, K-N-O-W peace. I think that ties hand in hand with what you're saying. Absolutely. Other comments? Mark. It does, both ways. Yeah, we know for a fact that many people who are arrested for abusing us with a spouse was raised in a home where their mother and father was abusive to them and to their mother. Or vice versa. It can be the wife against the husband. Yeah, good point. Absolutely. Other comments? Good comments. Okay? Verse 13 through 18 talks about God's care for the poor. And we talked about the poor quite a bit. Verse 13 reads, "For whoever shuts his ears to the cry of the poor will also cry himself and not be heard." Pretty powerful statement when you break it down and look at it. If you shut your ears to the cries of those who are in need, someday when you're in need, God's not going to hear. Solomon says here that the one who refuses to help the poor has in reality refused to help those loved by the Lord and will be rejected in his own day of need. Turn with me over to Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6 and 38. Jesus speaks here, says, "Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put into your bosom. For with the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you." What a powerful statement Jesus makes here. Okay? Remember that Jesus said it is more blessed to give than to receive. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. More blessed to give than to receive. Go back to chapter 19 in Proverbs, verse 17. Solomon writes here, "He who has pity on the poor lends to the Lord, and he will pay back what he has given." What person wouldn't want to lend something to the Lord? I like that. Yes? Me. Exactly. So let me ask you a question. What's the bottom line here? What's Solomon trying to get a point across? What point is he trying to get across? I think, Mark? Full circle. Yeah, yeah. And going hand in hand with that, I think it's where the Lord pleads for us and His advocate of the poor to help them is to lend to the Lord. It's like helping the Lord. It's being Christ-like is really what it boils down to. Other thoughts or comments? Jack? That's right. Pass it down. Pay it forward, as they say. Mark? Can. Yeah. I wish Jason was here. He's up in Murphy's, him and Serena, the kids are up in Murphy's preaching today. But Jason told a story one time at Woodward Park there in Fresno where the youth group would get together and make sandwiches. and take them down to, the poor on Skid Row, if you will, and feed them. They had nothing. They were hungry. And maybe they get a conversation started. That conversation could lead to a Bible study. We got to look beyond walls right here for people to help. Other comments? Patricia. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tattered. Yeah. Yeah. Pretty sad situation when that happens. Any other comments? Okay, let's go on to verses 14 and 15, kind of go hand in hand. It says, a gift in secret pacifies anger, and a bribe behind the back strong wrath. It is a joy for the just to do justice, but destruction will come to the workers of iniquity. I got to be honest with you, I wrestled with this proverb a little bit, because what are we talking about here? A gift in secret. Talking about bribery. And we've talked about bribery a lot before, how it's wrong. This statement corresponds with others. We know one thing for sure. Bribery works, doesn't it? For most of the time. I won't say 100% of the time. It can. But here's the thing. This should not be interpreted to mean that God approves of it. Okay? Let me ask this question. Has anybody ever been wronged by somebody and that person tried to make it right by giving you a gift? Oh, come on, ladies. How many times have your husbands made you mad, and the husbands, you went out and bought flowers? Come on, that's bribery. That's a gift. Trying to make it right. It's true. Okay? I think the point that Solomon makes here is that generosity and fairness blesses not only those upon whom it is bestowed, but more so, real pleasure is returned in the hearts of those who give it. Remember, as I quoted a little earlier, Acts 20 and 35, Jesus is quoted as saying, "Blessed is more blessed to give than receive." I think what we're talking about here, you take that with verse 15 together, and it may be instructing one to avoid, if you will, litigation by means of a gift. In other words, an out-of-court settlement. How many times does that appear, or does that happen? You give somebody something. People used to all the time, if they maybe offended somebody, would go home and make an apple pie and give to that person to say, I'm sorry. It's a gift to show sincerity sometimes. And I think that's the point that Solomon makes here. Bribery is wrong, but it can be under certain circumstances, I guess. Yeah, I think, excellent. Yeah, it's what's in your heart. It's the reason behind what you're doing. Yeah, Mark. Yeah. No, we sometimes do that to try to make amends of things. Jack. All right. But one thing to remember in all this is justice is essential if society is to function and evildoers to be held in check or accountable. Okay? When people do wrong, they have to be held accountable. Bottom line. Any other thoughts? Okay, moving on to verse 16 and 17. A man who wanders from the way of understanding will rest in the congregation of the dead. Solomon has once again sounded the warning that more than pleasure is at stake here. The stakes in the game of life are very high. Eternal life or eternal death. The ultimate fate of those who do wrong is viewed in these next three verses. Verse 7, or I'm sorry, going back to lost my place here. We're in 16. A man who wanders away from the understanding will rest in the congregation of the dead. Okay, number 17. He who loves pleasures will be poor man, will be a poor man. He who loves wine and oil will not be rich. In 18, the wicked shall be a ransom for the righteous and the unfaithful for the upright. Verse 17. Who is actually poor here? What does it say? He who loves pleasure is poor. The person who forsakes the way of wisdom and lives for self-indulging pleasure deceives himself. His wealth is temporary and his days are numbered. Remember the story of rich man and Lazarus, Luke 16. Okay? Verse 18, we read that. The wicked shall be a ransom for the righteous, and the unfaithful for the upright. God can prevent the evil planned for the righteous, and instead reward it to the wicked. He can prevent evil planned for those who are righteous, instead give it to those who are wicked. Thoughts? Comments? Yes, James. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Other comments? Verse 19, we've already discussed this back earlier. It is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman. Verse 20, there is desirable treasure and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man squanders it. This is a common point of view, if you will, of Proverbs, that the wise are wealthy and the fool is in poverty. This is perhaps true materially, but most definitely it is true spiritually. Okay? What kind of treasure does a wise man store up? Treasure in heaven. Turn over to Matthew 6. Matthew 6, verses 19 through 21. Jesus says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's the kind of treasure we need to store up, the ones that will be eternally kept for us in heaven. Comments? Moving on to verse 21. He who follows righteousness and mercy finds life, righteousness, and honor. What a happy and joyous promise this verse is when you think about it. Righteousness and mercy have rewards. Solomon says here, pursue these, and the result will be a righteous character that is honored with respect from fellow men and the joy of living life to the fullest. Look at 1 Peter 3 and 10. Peter writes, for he who would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking guile. If we do the right thing, what kind of life do we hope to live? A good life, a righteous life. one that is full of joy and contentment. Any thoughts? Moving on to verse 22. A wise man scales the city of the mighty and brings down the trusted stronghold. A wise man. What kind of wisdom are we talking about here? Godly wisdom. Absolutely. Seeing things from God's point of view. How often do we do that? Not often enough, I think. I can speak personally myself. You know, we sometimes try to figure things out based upon what we see and feel. And that's not always right. Not always right. Solomon says here that the kind of wisdom is stronger. We're talking godly wisdom here, stronger than bodily might or strength. And in the spiritual battle, enables one to bring down the strong hold of the wicked. Look over at 2 Corinthians 10 and 4, please. Actually, let's read verse 3 with that also. Paul writes, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal," in other words, not fleshly, "but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds." That's where we get our strength from, is from God. Amen to that. Any other thoughts on that particular verse? Okay. Verse 23. Whoever guards his mouth and tongue keeps his soul from trouble. Again, we've talked about this before. Caution in speech has already been mentioned, both in Proverbs 13 and 3, 18 and 21, and of course, James speaks of it a lot in chapter 3, verse 2, about the tongue. The troubles referred here are probably ones that are social, maybe legal difficulties that one could encounter if such imprudent talk was spoken. Sometimes we get ourselves in trouble, don't we? Saying things that we shouldn't. Mark? Yeah. Apologize. Sure. You know, we've all been there and done things like that we're, we wish we hadn't have. It's hard to put the car back in the garage once it's gotten out. Yeah. Any other comments? Okay, verse 24. A proud and haughty man, scoffer is his name. He acts with arrogant pride. We've talked about this before. Arrogance is despised by all, and who is motivated by rude and arrogant lack of respect is called a scoffer. What he's saying here. Burton Kaufman said this of this particular verse. "Show me a conceited person, and I will show you someone who is arrogant, proud, and inconsiderate." Isn't that true? Isn't that true? Verse 25. The desire of the slothful kills him, for his hands refuse to be labor. And again, we've discussed laziness. The craving for ease and rest is never satisfied for a lazy person, but neither will his hunger be satisfied, for he will always be in poverty. We saw that back in Proverbs 20 and verse 4 about the sluggard not wanting to work during the winter hours. Verse 26, he covets greedily all day long, but the righteous gives and does not spare. Solomon says here, greed eats like a cancer, always robbing its victim of contentment, of giving. Again, quoting Jesus, more blessed to give than receive. Question, can we take it with us when... No. And I'll tell you, the proof of that is you never see a U-Haul trailer being pulled by a hearse, do you? Doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. You cannot take it with you. That's right. You can do a lot of good with it, can't you? Verse 27. Sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination, and much more when it brings with it wicked intent. We're talking again here about vain worship. Sacrifice offered without the desire to obey the Lord is hypocrisy, especially so when it is offered with a wicked mind, as if to bribe God to overlook sins one has no intentions of renouncing. Remember Galatians 6 and 7? God is not mocked. You cannot think that you can get away with a bribe with God. Any thoughts on that? I think we're going to make it to the end of the chapter here. Verse 28. A false witness shall perish, but the man who hears him will speak endlessly. Disgust before a dishonest witness will perish, but a truthful man will never be forgotten. Verse 29, a wicked man hardens his face, but as for the upright, he establishes his way. I like how the ESV says, gives thought to his way. Gives thought to his way. What we're talking about here is stubborn rebellion. You ever seen that in somebody before? Yeah. Stubborn rebellion. An ungodly man who does not intend to repent can harden his heart and become insensible to being rebuked. We see that in Ephesians 4:19. And then the last two verses, I'll read together. There is no wisdom or understanding or counsel against the Lord. The house is prepared for the day of the battle, but deliverance is of the Lord. What does the horse stand for here? Military power. Yeah, military power. Foes may prepare to the fullest for the day of battle. We've seen this. Massing amounts of equipment and ammunition and things of that nature. But deliverance of victory, as it says in the NIV and ESV, belongs to the Lord. That's who gives the victory. Both from the beginning of this chapter to the end of this chapter, it stresses that the power of God is supreme. That's where it's at. Are there any questions about chapter 21? I think we're about a minute early, so that's good. Thank you very much.